Hello and welcome to Face Off here on France 24. Molenbeek has become a household name over the past few months, especially since the terrorist attacks in Paris and, of course, in Brussels. This neighborhood of the Belgian capital is widely described as a jihadist hotbed and often branded as an example of what governments should not be doing. And here in France, it prompted a heated controversy after a minister suggested that the country has hundreds of such areas. With me to discuss this latest controversy, Philip Pearl from Radio France Internationale and Stefan de Vries from the Dutch TV station RTL 4. Many of you and many of us, let's say it this way, had never really heard about Patrick Caner, who is the minister in charge of urban affairs and sports. However, what he said in the wake of the Brussels attack certainly did not go unnoticed.
Zero tolerance, French Minister for Urban Affairs Patrick Caner says, is the only way to weed out extremism in France. Drawing comparisons to Belgium's jihadi hotspot Molenbeek, the Socialist Party politician sparked controversy over the weekend, warning that radicalized elements have scores of vulnerable French neighbourhoods in a stranglehold too.
There are 100 neighbourhoods in France that are potentially comparable to Molenbeek. We are taking the bull by the horns.
Many of the majority have adopted a more conservative line, accusing the minister of overstating the threat.
I don't agree with his statement. I know Patrick very well. He's a good minister. In the neighbourhoods that he's referring to, there are areas where there is a concentration of radicalization, but to label entire districts is stigmatizing. We need a strategy to counter terrorism.
As the hunt for suspects with links to attacks in Brussels and Paris is ramped up Europe-wide, for Patrick Caner, vigilance on the home front means funneling resources into vulnerable areas, investing into education and tackling unemployment.
Stefan de Vries, obviously there's a lot of tension in France, in Belgium, because of the terrorist attacks, the ongoing police operation. Was he right to say what he said? He then apologized. He was talking about potential Molenbeeks in France. However, the damage was done already.
Well, yeah, it depends on what you understand by Molenbeek.
Exactly.
Because Molenbeek is one of the districts of Brussels. It's a very lively neighborhood. There are over 100,000 people living, so it's not a small neighborhood. It's a real, like a small city, basically, within the city. And areas within Molenbeek are known for their, the jihadist hotspots, as you call it, and also very close community. A lot of different communities living together, but they're not talking to each other. They're basically living their own lives. If the minister means by Molenbeek a segregated society with a lot of unemployment, social economic contrast, then yeah, he may be right because, well, you know.
Is this what he was alluding to, you think?
Well, I think I watched the interview and I think that's what he really meant. I'm not quite sure whether he means that there are 100 areas in France where you have a lot of potential terrorists. I'm not quite sure about that, but I think that it really meant that there are a lot of areas in France that have been let down by the government for many, many years already, and which concentrate a very high level of unemployment, 40 to 50%, and are basically disconnected with the rest of the country.
However, many politicians have taken his words to mean that there are hundreds of places where terrorist groups could be preparing attacks against France, other countries. Is this what you think is the right interpretation, or do you agree with Stefan that basically he's saying what many politicians have said, most vividly maybe the Prime Minister himself, who talked several months ago about a social economic apartheid in France?
Well, I don't like these kind of remarks because I think they have a counter effect, a negative effect on society in general. You have an area like Molenbeek. You have these comments from the French Minister for Cities and Towns saying that in France there are hundreds of other Molenbeeks. And as Stefan was saying, well, what do we mean by Molenbeek? Does that mean everywhere you have a majority Muslim population, you have a hotspot of potential terrorist activity? Does that mean that where there are Muslims living in areas of France that automatically is going to be a hotspot of potential terrorist activity? No, it doesn't mean that. Now, it doesn't mean that all those areas are no-go zones. Like we had these famous no-go zones in Paris that an American network was talking about, which wasn't true. But it's a way of, I think, trying to stir up public opinion, trying to create a political debate, and the bottom line is that you split the political spectrum down the middle, where you've got those in favour more or less on the far right and on the right, and those who are not in favour on the left. And that's what's happened in this case. And it's unfortunate because it's stigmatising a whole population who really doesn't need to be stigmatised right at the moment.
So it's a mishap. It was not his intention, but that's the result.
As they say in French, it's maladroit. Maladroit is the French word for it. And this kind of these kind of comments which are made in public are always going to create problems afterwards, because you cannot stigmatise a whole population. What does Molenbeek mean? Does it mean the whole area is a hotbed of terrorist activity? Does it mean only certain buildings or certain streets might be hotbeds of terrorist activity? I think it probably means the second, but the way it's been said is that it's the whole area, so be careful.
And the way it's been welcomed, if you want, by politicians is also telling. We've seen politicians on the right and even on the far right, the National Front, saying, finally, a socialist minister tells the truth, because the assumption is that socialist, leftist governments are very careful not to really enrage disgruntled population, not to stigmatize other communities. So the fact that the National Front says, hey, finally someone tells the truth, is telling in a way.
Of course, that's exactly what they want to hear, because a lot of people will interpret what the minister said as Muslims are terrorists. I mean, people are simple and they just make this connection. So this is exactly what the Front National would like us to believe. But I do think Patrick Canard, it would be too easy to say that he's wrong, because that there is a real problem in France in general, in the suburbs. But that's the major the events in 2005 with the riots in all the suburbs. That's already over 11 years ago, and since then nothing really happened. A lot of money has been invested in those suburbs, but money is not enough. This country is very segregated. There's a huge social divide between rich and poor. It's far more a social economical problem than a religious problem, because if you go into the suburbs, you find a lot of different people from different backgrounds as well, and what their connection is the fact that they don't have any chance in this society. And basically, I have the impression that the French and French politicians in particular are pretty much, well, they don't really care about this situation, because it really, it's handy that these people are not interfering in the civil society in France. So a lot of people have been complaining about this, or a lot of researchers also for many years have said, we have a real problem, we should do something about it. Everybody knows it. But it basically, I mean, there are over 20 million people in France living in the suburbs. There are many suburbs which are very nice to live in, but there is a concentration of suburbs where you have a lot of problems. And a lot of these people living in those suburbs they just feel left alone by the government, and that it's not something about it doesn't make really a difference if it's a socialist or a right-wing government. The problems are there, and but it's easy to make the connection with terrorism, which of course is not right.
Right, but I mean, we said earlier that it was probably a mistake, a mishap, whatever, he misspoke, but the fact that someone on the left addresses one way or the other the issue of radical Islam, the issue of terrorism, and the link to some neighborhoods, isn't this a way maybe for the left to say we're not naive? We know that there are security threats in this country, looking ahead at next year's presidential election, a way to convey to the French people, hey, we're not naive, we know what we're talking about, we're serious people, even though it could go against their core beliefs.
But it's coming from the wrong person. This is not Patrick Canard who should be saying this. It should be coming from the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, or even from François Hollande, the President, or the Interior Minister.
But they cannot say this. It's too sensitive.
Yeah, but they need to maybe be a bit more outspoken about the situation in France, or to be a bit more courageous about the situation in France, which I don't think the government is. I don't think the previous government was either. I think, as Stefan says, they tried to sort of sweep all this under the carpet and say, oh, it doesn't really exist. There are very nice suburbs. You can go and stay there. There have been investments in these poorer suburbs in France, but not enough. The bottom line is, how many of these people are potential terrorists? I don't think there are that many in France. There are obviously those who are going to be sought after by the, people who are interested in recruiting potential terrorists, who are unemployed, who are petty criminals, who live in areas where there's not enough integration. If you look at Molenbeek, there's like 40% unemployment. So the Belgians are just as guilty as the French in maybe not integrating and offering these young people a better future than some of the young people in suburbs in France. So that's the bottom line. I don't think that those who are involved in petty criminality, in selling and buying drugs, or who are unemployed, are all necessarily going to be potential jihadis one day. But there are one or two in there. That's what the French need to worry about. That's what the French authorities should be working on. And that's where better integration is needed in this country. But it's not only the authorities who need to do that. It's all of us who need to do that. There needs to be less discrimination in France, I think, against minority groups, and that's the role that every French person needs to play.
Very quickly, Stéphane, are you optimistic that this will indeed happen, or because of the tensions, because of the rise of the National Front, because of radical Islam striking Europe and other places, it's not going to happen anytime soon? As
Philip said, there's a link between heavy crime and jihadism, and that needs to be investigated much more thoroughly than focusing on some, radical imams who just talk but don't act. I think, it's a very complicated issue, but I do really think that, the minister may have a point.
Okay, we'll have to follow that issue. Again, in the coming weeks, it will be certainly a debate during the forthcoming elections. Thank you for watching this edition of Face Off. We'll see you next week here on France 24.